such a great privilege for us to be able to learn with Rabbi Daniel. And for those of you who he sent this link to, but who are not familiar with where you are or what you're doing, this is a weekly program hosted by the Jewish Collaborative of Orange County, which is the organization I founded 9 years ago. We have an adult learning program that features some of our nation's finest teachers. Maybe not everybody knows who they are. We have a great lineup for the fall with Rabbi Suzanne Singer, who will be teaching a class on Job, and very well-known scholar out of Lehigh University, Hartley Lachter, will be teaching a course on Kabbalah, mysticism, and the Mormons, and like he has his thesis is how Mormonism is actually based on Kabbalah. It's quite fascinating, and he's a master teacher also. And then we have a great lineup. Daniel will be back in December. So again, I will put a link into the chat at some point if you're interested in helping make ALI possible. We appreciate that. This organization exists exclusively on voluntary donations. Everybody's welcome all the time to anything, and we're grateful that you're here. This class is also recorded. If you're going to miss one of the 3 sessions with Daniel, you'll be able to catch it, even if you can't make it. So we're really glad that you're here. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to our scholar for today.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's so nice to be here with you all again. I'm going to try to paint an impossible background setting just to catch everybody up on the history before Kabbalah, just so we're coming in all with the same basic framework. One of the fun challenges about teaching at different points in Jewish history is the sort of historical nerd in me always wants to paint the full historic picture before, but you can end up getting caught there forever. So the 2 or 3 minute version of everything you need to know before going into the medieval Jewish period, which is where Kabbalah really takes off, at least in the form that we know today, is if you show up to synagogue, right, just to paint the picture, and you flip through the Torah, or you flip through the rest of the Tanakh, or you go to the later works, the rabbinic works, the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Talmud, and say you delve into the entire thing. You read the entire Tanakh, and then you read the entire Talmud. It'll probably take you a couple of years. And then somebody asks you a very simple question. Try to describe God from everything that you've read. That would be very difficult. And it would be very difficult for a number of reasons. First, it would be very difficult because the Tanakh and the Talmud is not necessarily a coherent book of philosophy. And what I mean by that is, unlike, say, early Greek works, right? You can read Aristotle and you can read Plato and you can read other Greek thinkers. Their goal really was to start off with premises and then use logic and analysis and rhetoric to end up at a conclusion that makes sense given the premises, right? So we've all, learned about the Pythagorean theorem in Greek thought, right? And this is a very logical mathematical equation that you can give to anybody, and if they understand the logic, they can go from premise to conclusion. When you read the Tanakh, it reads much more like a series of mythological stories, and when I say myth, I don't mean necessarily to discredit the truth claims, but it's not meant to be a book of philosophy. The Tanakh doesn't seem to care fundamentally about the background philosophic questions. So just as an example, right, we're all familiar, of course, with the opening verse of the Torah. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? There's some debate about how exactly to translate that. The Tanakh is not interested in many questions that philosophers might be interested, which is, what was God doing before the earth? How did God create the earth? What was the substances that God used to create the earth? These are the things that take up pages and pages and books of Greek philosophy. You have all these debates between Aristotle and Plato, and Aristotle, of course, believed the universe was here forever, and Plato believed it was created out of primordial matter. The Tanakh seems uninterested in that, right? The stories in Genesis about creation, as scholars would say, have a certain type of austerity to them. They're lacking a lot of philosophic background, not because the ancient Israelites and ancient Jews weren't deep philosophic thinkers, but because fundamentally, the point of the Torah the point of the Tanakh, the point of the Talmud was centered around ethics and living your life, as opposed to the background Tanakh and the background philosophic and theologic speculation. So another way to say this is the goal of you reading the first 3 chapters of the book of Genesis is not that you have a great scientific or philosophic picture about the nature of God and how the world was created. It's that you understand the central moral messages that then become the central moral messages of Judaism, namely, humans were created in the image of God. Humans have a divine imperative to care for nature, to care for the earth. Humans have a chance potentially of one day returning to the garden, of perfecting the world. It's only until the year 1000 CE, right? I'm going to anchor us, scholars, anybody here that's an expert in medieval Jewish thoughts can critique me one generation before or after, but it's really around the year 1000 CE. So now about 2000 years after the days of the Tanakh, the days of the Torah, that Judaism becomes interested in these questions, that all of a sudden we start to see books of Jewish philosophy that are in dialogue in some way with Greek philosophy, with Greco-Roman philosophy, with Islamic philosophy. And one way to think of this is as follows. I'm fast forwarding our history, right? We're all aware during biblical times, the vast majority of the Jewish community was centered around the land of Israel. We just commemorated Tisha B'Av a couple of days ago. Tisha B'Av obviously commemorates the destruction of the temple and the subsequent exiling of the Jewish people scattered around the world. The Talmud was then produced in that exilic time where half the Jewish community was in Israel and half the Jewish community was in Babylonia. But then in about the year 900, the Jewish landscape begins to change, and Jews from Babylonia start to move south through North Africa up to Spain. Some Jews continue going towards the rest of Europe. We tend to call those Ashkenazi Jews, Jews who centered around Germany. And a much larger percentage of the Jewish community stopped in the Iberian Peninsula, in the Spain-Portugal area. And there they were welcomed into what all scholars agree for the medieval times was quite a multicultural society. This was a society run primarily by the Islamic world, and the Islamic world at this time took a renewed interest in works of philosophy. And so all of a sudden, right, we can think about it this way. You had Aristotle and Plato that for about 1,000 years, nobody touched, right? So they were talking in the 3rd and 2nd and 1st centuries BCE. And then for about 1,000 years, for a variety of reasons, most of the reasons are connected to the church and trying to squash the influence that a lot of Greek philosophy had on new Christians. Nobody touched Aristotle and Plato for a couple hundred years until there was a reemergence in about 900 or the 9th century, 10th century, 11th century in the Islamic world, in the Iberian Peninsula. But now, of course, Jews have a problem, and Kabbalah, if anything, is an answer to a problem. And it's a very profound answer, but to understand the answer, we have to understand the problem, because a lot of times when Kabbalah is presented, it's presented just as a set of ideas, and people here are probably familiar with the Sefirot, which we'll get to in about 20 minutes, of the different aspects of God and attributes of God. And a lot of people have no clue where that comes from, right? How is it that Judaism that believes in one God, where does this tree of different types of divine attributes come from? So to understand the solution and how it ended up there, we have to understand the problem. And the problem was as follows. Once the books of Aristotle and Plato started getting translated into Arabic, which was the language that Jews in Spain would have spoken in the 10th and 11th century, all of a sudden, you can imagine young Jewish students coming home from their days in public school and them saying, I don't get it. When I go to shul, when I go to synagogue on Shabbat or on holidays, and we read stories about God in the Torah, God is very tangible and God is very immanent, right? God is there with the Israelites in the desert. There's open miracles. There is such a thing as prophecy, right? God is communicating with humans, and God, again, can be defined. God can be talked about. Obviously, in the biblical perspective, God is much greater than any one human, but at least generally, the way that our tradition in the Tanakh and the Talmud related to God in antiquity was that you can describe God, right? We do this all the time, right? In a month and a half during the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, we're going to say over and over again descriptors of God, right? God is merciful, God is slow to anger, God is righteous, all of these things. So on the one hand, you have young Jewish school children going to shul and hearing these very vivid, very anthropomorphic descriptions of God. On the other hand, you then go to your science class, and science and philosophy were fundamentally connected in the medieval period in a way that they are not today. And so you'd go to science class, you'd go to your metaphysics class, and you'd open up Aristotle, and Aristotle's teachings would say, God is not tangible at all. God is wholly in the background, a much more deistic, if you will, understanding of the world. God in Aristotle's language is an unmoved mover, right? So God is just the thing that you need to start the force and the rotation of the universe, but it has no meaning to actually say that God does or God has or anything like that. So a huge problem. And this is not just a problem, again, that some people who are interested in philosophy might have had. This is a fundamental clash between two completely different philosophies and outlooks of life. So I'm going to share my screen and go into some sources. And at any point, if anybody here has any thoughts, questions, or anything like that, please let me know. I'm just painting the background and then we'll get into some more discussion here. So you might think it's strange that I am starting a class on Kabbalah with Moses Maimonides, because Moses Maimonides, the medieval Sephardic rabbi, is often known as the Jewish rationalist par excellence. And Moses Maimonides was. But to understand the Kabbalah and where the Zohar eventually goes, we have to understand Maimonides, who was alive 1 or 2 generations before the compilation of the Zohar in the exact same historic time period. So Maimonides is seen as the pinnacle, the apex of this Jewish medieval rationalistic movement. And what I mean by Jewish medieval rationalistic movement, all I mean is the entire attempt by medieval Jewish thinkers to bridge these two gaps, right? You have the Greek world, you have Aristotle and Plato, and you have the world of Torah, right? You can think of it as Athens versus Jerusalem, right? There are a lot of ways to paint this dichotomy, 2 different ways of viewing the world and viewing God. How do you bridge this? Of course, one answer is to be a rejectionist, right? So one answer is to say, if Greek thought contradicts Judaism, I don't want anything to do with Greek thought. And that was certainly a position that many Jews and many rabbis in the medieval period took. You obviously can go the extreme on the other way, and you can say, if Greek philosophy and science contradicts Jewish thought, then Jewish thought must be wrong, right? That not necessarily the path of medievals, but that is, of course, the path that later thinkers, right? Baruch Spinoza, one of the pinnacle examples of somebody who went that route. But the medieval Jewish thinkers were a group of thinkers who were fundamentally connected in their mission to bridge these 2 gaps. So we get Moses Maimonides, and this is why he was so important. And Maimonides is going to embed Judaism with a type of rationalism that is fundamentally missing from the Torah and the Talmud. Another way to say it is as follows. If you were to go through the Torah, and even if you were to go through the Talmud, and you were to ask very simple questions, like, why do we keep kosher? The Torah doesn't tell you why you keep kosher. The Torah tells you how to keep kosher. You can learn what animals you can eat, what animals you shouldn't eat, which things you shouldn't mix to each other, how you slaughter an animal to make sure it's kosher. The Talmud picks up on a lot of these themes and engages in pages and pages and books of debates of exactly how to keep kosher. What happens if you make an item not kosher? How do you re-kosher it? But there's very little foundational discussion of anybody sitting back and surely asking, well, hey, why are we doing this in the first place, right? And it's not that this wasn't the question, but this just was not the foundational purpose of the Torah and the Talmud. The Torah and the Talmud were written in some sense for a group of people who already understood the importance of keeping kosher. And so you wouldn't have made it to discussing the cases in the Talmud about keeping kosher if you didn't already buy into the system. The problem now in the medieval period is when you have Jews coming home from their school and having just read Aristotle, you're going to, for the first time in hundreds of years, have young Jews saying, hey, wait a minute, I understand what the rules of kosher are, but why am I keeping kosher? Why am I keeping Shabbat? What is the purpose, right? You can imagine the wicked son to some extent at the Passover Seder, right? Like, what is all this? Why are we doing this? And so as a big part of this medieval rationalistic endeavor, the rabbis and philosophers of medieval Judaism prescribed reasons for all of the commandments, right? And so you can read in Moses Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, right? It's one of his most famous institutions, is going through and ordering what's called the Tamei HaMitzvot, or the reasons for the mitzvot. So Maimonides tells us why you keep kosher. And it turns out, according to Maimonides, and I don't want to debate the merits of what I'm about to say, but Maimonides says you keep kosher because it is healthier. And so keeping kosher just leads to a better quality of life. And that better quality of life allows you to better serve God and better contemplate the mysteries of God in the universe. And so there aren't, so when you read the Talmud and when you read the Torah, this isn't just a set of random ideas of eat cows, don't eat pigs, don't mix cows with milk, slaughter them a certain way. These all have very specific reasons. For Maimonides, in the example of kosher, it was related to health, right? So this was part of Maimonides' big project. The other big institution of Maimonides, and here is where I promise it will become relevant to Kabbalah. For those wanting to jump right into Kabbalah, I apologize for this 15-minute introduction, but I promise it will be helpful for our understanding later. Maimonides came up with perhaps his most radical idea. And this is an idea that led to Maimonides starting a 300-year controversy in the Jewish world known as the Maimonidean controversy. It included different cities rivaling with each other and battling for different religious and political power. It involved Jews and rabbis excommunicating each other back and forth. It began in some more dogmatic circles of the Jewish community a whole set of cherems, or banishments from the community, to be sent away. And so Maimonides comes up with this idea, negative theology, in his Guide to the Perplexed, which is as follows. He says, know that when you make an affirmation ascribing another thing to him, you become more remote from him in two respects. So just to paint a little bit of background, the him is God. And Maimonides is saying something very philosophically interesting about God. He is saying that every time you describe God, you might think you're doing something great. And so if somebody here sits and says that God is great, or God is merciful, or God is strong, or God is caring, or God does, or any adjective you might use to describe God, you might think you are doing something good. But Maimonides says you're actually distancing yourself from God. Why? One of them is that everything you affirm is a perfection only with reference to us. So Maimonides says, first, we have a language problem, right? This is what later scholars of language might call, right? There's just a problem with language, right? One way to think of this in our own lives is trying to describe an idea such as love, right? So if somebody were to ask you, describe love, right? An intangible thing, right? We all know what love is. We all know what it feels like to love somebody, a friend, a relative, a partner, something like that. But if somebody had never experienced love, right, you can imagine, the day that artificial intelligence actually, becomes general AI, and they go to you and they ask, I understand everything in the universe, but what do humans mean when they write in poetry and literature to love, right? How do you describe it? You can obviously try to use metaphor, right? You can try to say, love is like when you're seeing a beautiful sunset, and right, like you can try, but obviously anybody who actually understands love, right, you can't describe it, right? It is in some way beyond description. And so with God, we have that problem times 10, because with God, if God is infinite in some way, anytime you describe God using an adjective, we immediately think of our own human perception. So an example, if we say that God is merciful, right? We all know what it means to be merciful. And maybe somebody says, well, hey, I know what mercy is, right? I remember that, Megan is a very merciful person. And so you begin to think of God in terms of human interaction. Now, the problem is, if God is the capital G, right, the greatest and the ultimate and the infinite, then God isn't just a quantitative difference in, say, greatness or merciful than Megan or any of us. God is qualitatively different. And so there's a fundamental disconnect that anytime you describe God using any adjective, you are automatically butchering people's conception of God, because you're falling back into this problem of God is not just a human that has superpowers. God is fundamentally something different. And every time you describe God, you go back to this human with superpowers analogy. And so problem number one with describing God is people are going to have complete misconceptions of God. The second, Maimonides says, he does not possess a thing other than his essence. So Maimonides is now dealing with a second problem. The second problem, as we all know from our liturgy, right? We say God is one, right? It's one of the foundational ideas of Judaism, right? Really, the first two of the 10 commandments are about the idea of the oneness of God. Shema, which is one of the centers of our liturgy, right, affirms that God is one. And when you really understand what it means to be one, it means to not have any multiplicity. And so if you start to describe things in terms of their adjectives and composite parts, you are actually breaking down the fundamental oneness. And so for Maimonides, if you're really saying that God is one, it means that you can't say anything else about God. God is, God exists, but period. Any other adjectives you try to throw out there, you are fundamentally distancing yourselves from God. So this is Maimonides' big philosophy. He then spends the rest of his book, Guide to the Perplexed, developing his interpretation of the Torah given this philosophy. This is why, just as the second to last comment I make about Maimonides, and then we'll switch over and you'll see why this is relevant to Kabbalah in a second. This is why Maimonides is such an important thinker, and really all roads of Jewish philosophy run through Maimonides, because for the next 800 years of Jewish thought, and Maimonides was around at the late 1100s, early 1200s, all roads in Jewish philosophy post Maimonides either has to accept Maimonides and give further interpretations, or reject Maimonides and explain why. But any Jewish philosophic book after Maimonides cannot ignore Maimonides, right? He becomes the person to base or challenge your ideas based off of. So any thoughts, just taking a step back before we go into Kabbalah and the Zohar? Maimonides writes this in medieval Spain and then later on Egypt. Anything there? Julian asked if there's a link to the slides. Julian, I'll send that out after. The source sheet is just a slideshow.
And I'll just add, Daniel, that what we can do is we can, when we post the recording of this class, we can actually post a link to we'll put your source sheet under your class, or we'll put the slideshow under your class so that people can listen and
I can't hear you, Marcia.
Does that make sense?
Perfect. Okay. So any other questions about Maimonides, medieval Jewish thought, anything that's going on here, which is going to be very important in about 10 seconds. Amazing. Okay. So what is Kabbalah, right? In the broadest sketch, again, this is a 3-part series on Kabbalah, so it helps a little bit to define our terms. This is going to be the next 2 minutes is going to be very introductory, and then we are going to dive into some post-introductory ideas. So Kabbalah, quite literally, for those that are coming at this with zero knowledge, Kabbalah literally in Hebrew comes from the word kabel, which of course is to receive. And so Kabbalah generally means something that is a received tradition. Kabbalah is also the term used in big catch-all description to understand the Jewish mythical and mystical tradition. There's something very interesting that Kabbalah does, which we'll talk about in a second, that unlike Maimonides, who explicitly understood and stated that what he was doing amounted to a radical new, in some ways, interpretation of the Torah and Judaism, Kabbalah tries to do it both ways. And what I mean by tries to do it both ways is the central idea or mission of Kabbalah, and this is taking place again in northern Spain and southern France, and the small group of esoteric philosophers tried to paint new ideas wrapped in old garb. And what I mean by that is the Kabbalists are very, very insistent that everything that they are doing is firmly rooted within Jewish tradition, right? They are not willing to be thought of, and they do not want to describe themselves as coming up with new ideas, right? Which seems odd, right? Because if you are a philosopher, right, such as Maimonides or such as Saadia Gaon, right, an earlier Babylonian thinker, or Gersonides, the Ralbag, right, a later Spanish thinker, if you're a philosopher, you sort of want your things to be thought of as new ideas, right? You know, very few deep thinkers or academics want to publish their thesis or want to publish their book and write in the introduction, nothing that I'm writing is new, right? You want to say, I have a new interpretation, right? Here it is. Kabbalah and the early Kabbalists were the exact opposite. They were very insistent that all of their ideas actually came from a deep-rooted tradition, both the true understanding of Torah and also throughout history. And you get some major theories here, which we're going to go back to at the end of class today. So I want to, I don't want to spend a lot of time, but there's a debate now in history, and this is just for the historical nerds here. So I'm going to give this for 8 seconds, and then we're going to delve into the ideas of Kabbalah. There's a debate of how to understand Kabbalah. And by the end of this class, and by the end of this 3 weeks, I think everybody here will have their own opinion on which side of this debate they end up in. But how do you understand Kabbalah from a Jewish historical perspective? Kabbalah developed in the exact same time period that Moses Maimonides was writing his hyper-rationalistic commentary and understanding of the Torah. So is Kabbalah just happened to grow parallel to Maimonides and his philosophy? Is Kabbalah a outright rejection of Maimonides and his philosophy? Or does Kabbalah build on Maimonides and his philosophy? I'm not going to ask people to answer that question yet. Maybe we'll get to that question probably next Monday. But Kabbalah takes this idea, and I'm going to skip this this next source. Maybe we'll come back to this at the end. But Kabbalah takes the idea of Maimonides and this idea of negative theology and starts with that at its premise. Again, Maimonides spends an entire book in the Guide to the Perplexed arriving at the conclusion that you cannot describe God. Kabbalah in the Zohar starts with that as a premise. So I'll read one source from the Zohar and we'll discuss it a bit, and then we have a couple more sources. So the Zohar, which is the central book of Kabbalah, says as follows. Ein Sof, right? Ein Sof in Hebrew means that which is without end, the infinite, the endless, does not abide being known, does not produce end or beginning. Primordial nothingness brought forth beginning and end. Who is beginning? The highest point, beginning of all, the concealed one abiding in thought. It also engenders end, the culmination of the word, but there no end. No desires, no lights, no sparks in that infinity. All these lights and sparks are dependent on it, but cannot comprehend. The only one who knows, yet without knowing, is the highest desire, concealed of all concealed, nothingness. And when the highest point in the world that is coming ascend, they know only the aroma, as one inhaling an aroma is sweetened. To summarize for the Zoharic unaffiliated, this seems a lot like Maimonides, but a lot more poetic. What the Zohar is saying here, and this is one of the foundational sources within the Zohar and Kabbalah of understanding God, is the Zohar, in a lot of ways, is agreeing with Maimonides and Maimonides' negative theology, which is saying God, the infinite, the Ein Sof, is not knowable, right? Again, a vastly, right? It's important for me to keep saying this every 10 minutes because of how radical the ideas of both Maimonides and the Zohar was. Vastly, vastly different than the Tanakh or the Talmud, because the Tanakh or the Talmud over and over again gives descriptors of God and explains God and talks about God's motives for things and everything like that. What the Zohar is saying here is the infinite God is unknowable, right? You can't know its beginning, you can't know its end, right? God has no desires, no lights, no sparks, right? God is infinite through and through. And to say that something is infinite means, by definition, there is no tangible quality to it, right? You know, one of the examples that I always like to give is if you were to try to teach a little kid, right? Say you have a 10-year-old and they ask you, what is infinity, right? I've been sitting in math class and I keep hearing this idea, infinity. And you were to say, what's the highest number you know? And this, you know, maybe we'll say it's a 5-year-old, right? Let's say this 5-year-old says, well, the highest number I know is 100 million. And you say, wow, that's a really big number. Imagine that infinity is 10 times 100 million. You have not given this kid not right. The answer to what you would have just done is it wouldn't just be off by a quantitative difference. You qualitatively would have given this child the wrong picture of infinity, right? To say that infinity is just a lot more than 100 million misses the point, because infinity is something totally different. Infinity in a mathematical setting is fundamentally the idea that this thing cannot be contained by any finite numbers. What you probably should have said to the 5-year-old or to the 6-year-old, infinity is not really a number. Infinity is a concept. And again, probably tough to explain infinity to a 6-year-old, but the way to not do it is to tell them infinity is just a really big number. The Zohar and Maimonides are essentially saying the same thing. Within God, there is no desire, no lights, no engender, nothing, because any finitude you give to God is going to depreciate people's understanding of God. Now, a lot of people here are probably thinking, well, I've seen some Kabbalah before, and Kabbalah has the idea of the Sefirot and different aspects of God. How the heck did we get there? We'll go there in about 5 or 10 minutes. But for now, the theological and philosophic premise of the Zohar, of Kabbalah, is that everything in this world is just a type of aroma, right? Being breathed out from the infinite in some way, or emulating in some way from the light of God, right? You can almost think of it, right? The Neoplatonists and Plotinus, who was also an early Greek thinker, had a famous metaphor of God being the sun, and anything on earth that is being radiated or warmed by the light of the sun, we recognize that that is not literally the sun, but that is an offshoot of the sun itself, right? So if I go out and it's a light day outside, or if I feel warmed by the sun, or if I get sunburned, we all recognize that that is such a minuscule part of the power of the sun, right? It doesn't make sense to really ask, well, what % of the sun sunburned me the other day when I was, at the beach for the day? We all recognize the sun is a force so much greater than the way that the sun shines here. And then Plotinus asks us to imagine God, who is qualitatively different than even a orb as powerful as the sun, and to try to understand it in that light. But one of the themes that I'll keep getting back to, and if there is a little bit of confusion in the way that I'm explaining this, it's that Kabbalah is emerging from a problem that humans have had from time immemorial, which is going back to this problem of language, which is, how do you describe something that is untangible using finite human language? How do you describe God, who is by definition undescribable, using human language, right? It's the exact same, right? The reason why the Kabbalists oftentimes like to use metaphors of love is because, as I said before, it's the same thing with love, right? You can have 50 years where all you are doing is writing. And if somebody asks you to write a 5-page essay on what love is, to the point where you can give it to artificial intelligence or an alien or somebody never experiencing love, you just would not be able to do it. And it's not because you don't understand what love is, right? We've all experienced love, but it's because there are some ideas that are non-tangible or non-finite in a way that allows it to be described, right? We all understand love when we feel it, and right, it's actually a very simple emotion, right? There's a simplicity to love, but it's impossible to explain. And Kabbalah is dealing with this exact same problem when it comes to God. So moving on a little bit, Kabbalah continues to delve into early Jewish theology. And again, like Maimonides, the Zohar is fundamentally an interpretation of the Torah. And so Kabbalah now is asking the big questions that the Greeks asked, that Maimonides asked, that the Tanakh and Talmud, as we discussed before, specifically does not delve into, which is what happened before creation, right? Creation is such an important part of religion, perhaps the greatest act that God has ever done. If you can't really describe God and God is untangible, what does creation mean, right? What does it mean for God to actually interact with the material world in some way? How does any of that make sense? The Zohar says as follows, and then I'm going to take some questions for thoughts here before going into our last couple sources for setting up the Zohar today. The Zohar says as follows: before he gave any shape to the world, before he produced any form, he was alone, without form, and without resemblance to anything else, right? So far, so good. Who then can comprehend how he was before creation? Hence, it is forbidden to lend him any form or similitude, or even to call him by a sacred name, or to indicate him by a single letter or a single point. What the Zohar is saying is God before creation is not what we mean when we say God, right? This is one of the most radical theological formulations of the Zohar. The Zohar continues and says, but after he created the form of the heavenly man, he used him as a chariot wherein to descend, and he wished to be called after his form, which is the sacred name, Yod-He Vav-He, or Adonai, or Hashem, or the name that we are familiar with from the Torah. To say this again, after he created the form of the heavenly man, he used him as a chariot wherein to descend, and he wished to be called after his form, which is the sacred name. What the Zohar is saying here is, when we talk about God in Jewish tradition, there are two completely different things that we are talking about. There is the capital G, God, the infinite God, the God of pre-creation, a God that is untangible, unrecognizable, undescribable, infinite, the Ein Sof, Maimonides, negative theology, Aristotle's unmoved mover, whatever metaphor you want to use, the God that is unfathomable, and so that you shouldn't even try, right? Don't try to give God any description. Don't try to understand what God wants from you. You're wasting your time, right? The Zohar says, okay, I understand this is what the Greeks are teaching in philosophy. This is what Maimonides is teaching. This is what, presumably from some perspective, a philosophic or scientific analysis of the world gives you, is a God who is behind the scenes and untangible. Great, that was God. But also, when the world was created, there was something that happened during that act of creation where a secondary emanation, right? I'm going to use the word emanation very purposefully, that God actually had to emanate outside of God's self. And in that gulf between the spiritual realm, right, God, and the material realm, or the realm of infinity to the realm of finitude, right, the realm of God being without end to the realm of a world that has things with time that means something, that not only did God have to create something from nothing in some way, right? You go from no matter and no material to a world and a universe, but that actually, from our perspective, and here's where we're getting into the great philosophic dialectic of the Zohar, from our perspective, when we then look back up to the cosmos and try to understand what it means to be in a relationship with God, we actually are able to be in relationship with God, God of the Torah, but that is just part of the emanation of God that was sparked during creation. So one other way to think about this, and if this is confusing, don't worry, this took up about the next 400 years of later Jewish thinkers trying to figure out what the heck to make of this. So hopefully by the end of 3 weeks, I'm not going to say we're all going to fully understand this. I think I don't fully understand this, but I can talk about different interpretations from later on in Kabbalah. But just one other way to think about it is when we talk about God, there are actually two different things that one could mean. You can talk about God, the capital G, and that we understand is philosophically true. Then there's the God of the Torah, the God that has descriptions, the God that we can feel. And it's not necessarily that this God is false or doesn't exist, but it's that it's recognizable or should be recognizable that this is a metaphor and it's representative of truth, but it can't possibly be true itself. The same thing that if you read a poem that I write about love, and I tell you love is like seeing your favorite sunset while eating your favorite food with a nice breeze, with, you know, all of the luxuries and all of the good feelings, right? You don't think this is literally love, but it's not false, right? You recognize that as a metaphor stemming from the problem of language, right? It's just impossible for me to describe love to you unless I, you know, fully impart my own personal feelings and emotion. And so we describe complicated things through metaphor. The God of the Torah, according to the Zohar, is this human attempt to understand God through metaphor, much the same way one would try to describe love through metaphor. So this is the great theological framework of Kabbalah. It takes Maimonides and takes Greek thought and says, this is true, and takes Jewish tradition, the Torah and the Talmud, and says, this is true, but they are talking about different things. Unlike the Greeks who rejected the Torah, and unlike Maimonides, who spent his life trying to synthesize, Kabbalah says they are both true, but on different planes of reality. From our human perspective, when we look around in the universe, the Torah and tradition are true, and they are a way to get to foundational truths of the universe. But at the end of the day, you have to realize this is only true metaphorically. This is only true from our perspective. One of the things that the Kabbalah oftentimes talks about, and then I promise I'll take a minute or two for any thoughts or questions, the Kabbalah always says the phrase from our side, right? It's a very common description of the Kabbalah, right? It'll describe some aspect of God or talk about the nature of God, and we'll get into that either at the end of class today or early next Monday. It will say, God is XYZ, God does XYZ, and then almost as if it's adding a disclaimer, mitzad shalanu, right? From our perspective, from our side, as if it's telling the readers, Kabbalah and Jewish tradition by extension is full of vivid descriptions of God, and we can talk about God, right? Unlike Maimonides, who would have penalized you if you were to say God does, God is, God wants, Kabbalah says, talk about that all you want. If anything, Kabbalah was the most anthropomorphic and is the most anthropomorphic form of Judaism, right? We're going to talk about the Sefirot. We probably won't get to it until next Monday, but we'll talk about the Sefirot. There is no more anthropomorphic depiction of God in Jewish tradition than the Sefirot. And so Kabbalah welcomes that. It says, give me everything. Give me the most vivid, colorful descriptions of God you can possibly come up with. And also understand this is only true from our side. But if you can understand this from the other side, from the God side, from the side of infinity, understand that this is only a type of metaphor or only a type of illusion that is only representative of the truth. Questions, thoughts, or anything like that before we have one or two more slides before we'll finish for today? So I see Julian wrote in the chat, is the heavenly human what is called the Adam Kadmon, the primordial man? So it's a great question. Just to give a little bit of background, the Kabbalists oftentimes speak about Adam as if Adam does not represent, Adam, a person, but Adam HaKadmon, which is this idea representative of the primordial man. And yes, in a lot of senses, it is connected. The idea in Kabbalah, we might get to this in class 3, or it might be a little bit beyond the scope, but Kabbalah imagines that at the outset of humanity, or at the outset of history, man and God, and when I say God here, I'm talking about the tangible God, Yud Hey Vav Hey, God of the Torah, were much more fundamentally connected than they are now. That there was a great breaking that happened during the Garden of Eden. And during this great breaking in the Garden of Eden, man distanced himself from God. And not only that, God itself, God's self, actually shattered in some way. Here's where you get also, right? I don't think anyone asked this, but I will preempt the question anyway, because I'm imagining there are people thinking about this, especially this source here, where we started with, seems very, very Christian-like. Right, we have a lot of ideas here that God is using a man as a chariot to go down to the earth, and the answer is emphatically yes. This is very Christian-like, and there are two different ways to understand this. Gershom Shalom, the famous scholar of Kabbalah, has numerous essays trying to understand and untangle Kabbalah from Christianity. And probably between the 20 of us in the Zoom call, we can come up with, some of the major theories as to the relationship. One obvious theory is to say that many Christian views stemmed from more ancient Jewish views that then were reemerged in Kabbalah. Obviously, you can read it the other way around. You can say that Kabbalistic views borrowed from Christian views. There's a second understanding that is where Gershom Shalom ends up landing that I think makes more sense, which is Christianity was also embroiled within this exact same paradox of theology and philosophy, right? The Christians and Jews, and by extension, even the Islamic world a little bit, when we talk about, say, Sufism in the Islamic world, we're also in the same paradox of how do you understand God and nature and philosophy? And if God is infinite, how is God tangible? And in the Christian sense, if God is one, how is God also three, right? All of these ideas. And just like if I split this group into two and, there's 10 people here and 10 people here, and I give everybody, the same prompts, there's a chance that the two groups their answers will be very parallel, right? Judaism and Christianity might have just arisen at similar answers due to the wider philosophic pressures. But that is a big academic question, and we'll put that aside. So one of the things that Kabbalah does, and before we go to this source, maybe I'll even just unshare my screen a bit, just so I don't get people distracted reading this long source. So Kabbalah and the Zohar specifically begins with this fundamental separation. And what I mean by this fundamental separation is, to create the world, God actually has to, in some way, emanate, or in some way split, or in some way reduce something that is infinite, right? This is going to be taken up much later on in the school of Tzfat with the Kabbalists, with Isaac Luria. We're going to get to this next Monday. This is the origins of the idea of Tikkun Olam, which we'll also talk about next Monday. But the Zohar already discusses a situation in which, if you want to have a world that is finite stem from something that is infinite, that thing that is infinite has to in some way reduce itself. Because if something is infinite, if God is infinite, there's no room for anything else, right? It's like any equation. If you add infinity into it, it just breaks. And so it doesn't make sense to say infinity minus 3 or infinity plus 3, right? The 3 is irrelevant. And so if God wanted to create a world, or if a world was created, right, in the language that the Kabbalists would probably approve of, if a world was created at some point, it meant that something in that infinity had to diminish. And this is now where Kabbalah gets into this idea of a great breaking that happened in primordial history. I forgot who asked before. Somebody before connected it to the story of the Garden of Eden. The Kabbalists are very interested in understanding the story of leaving the Garden of Eden as a representative of this great breaking. But there's a recognition in Kabbalah that not only is the world broken, right? Already the rabbis in the Talmud recognize that there are a lot of problems in the world. The rabbis in the Talmud always talk about, this is a backwards world, and, the world seems to make no sense according to, morals and logic. Fine, we have that in the Talmud. But what Kabbalah teaches is not only is the world broken, but actually God in some way is broken. Because from God to go from infinite to something finite, there had to have been some breakdown somewhere at the origins of history. And so the Zohar begins to play around with this idea of God lacking completion. And God went from being one to now actually being split into different either categories or emanations or composite parts. And this was a huge tragedy that happened at the origins of history, that God went from being one and perfect, and the world went from being perfect into the difficult and oftentimes disastrous world that we have today, where God is not necessarily one, but God is split into composite parts. The Kabbalists find interesting hints actually from our liturgy. Famously, right at the end of Aleinu, right, we say V'ne'amar v'haya Adonai l'melech kol haaretz bayom hahu yiyeh Adonai echad u'shemo echad. To translate that last verse, bayom hahu, on that day, right? It's talking about on that day where presumably the world is made whole again. Yiyeh Adonai echad u'shemo echad. Yehiyeh in Hebrew means will be. So the Kabbalists interpret that bayom hahu yehiyeh Adonai echad. On that day, God will be one. And so the Kabbalists say, okay, our goal is to make God one, but it's clear that God is not one now, right? We say it every single time we have any prayer service. Our goal is to make God one, but God is not one currently because of the great brokenness of the world. And the primary way that the Kabbalists do this is through a psychological framework, which we'll probably get to next week, and a gender framework, which we're going to get to right now. And so the Kabbalists talk about God, right, using all of their imagery about love, as God as two lovers who were forcibly removed in some sense and are now struggling to get back together. And the Kabbalists love this framework because it works perfectly, right? You can imagine one of the lovers to be Yod-Heh Vav-Heh, right, the tangible God, and one of the lovers to be the Jewish people that are trying to get back together to complete the completion, right? You can use the metaphor however you want, but here is how the Kabbalists use this, right? So this is, again, a story from the Zohar, and it goes as follows. Rabbi Shimon was journeying to Tiberia, to Tiberias, and there was with him Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Chia. While on the way, they saw Rabbi Pinchas coming to meet them. After exchanging greetings, they all sat down under a great shady hill by a hillside. Rabbi Shimon said, "It is written in the Torah, and he went on his journey from the south of Bethel onto the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Chai. It said he went on his journeys instead of his journey. Why is that?" So the Zohar, like many Jewish thinkers, is interested in biblical interpretation, and it says, we have this one story about Jacob, and it says journeys, right? It's like if I say James went on his journeys as opposed to James went on his journey. And so the obvious question is, why are you referring to an individual in the plural? The Zohar says as follows: this is a reference not only to his own journeying, but also that of the Shekhinah, who always went with Jacob. And therefore we learn that every person needs to be male and female at all time for the sake of his faith. He ought not to think or imagine that the Shekhinah forsakes him in any way. See, it has been said, a man ought to cleave to his wife, and the Shekhinah may always be with him. Yet it is possible to go alone on a journey, and the Shekhinah will still be with him. And when doing so, he ought to direct his prayer to the Holy One that this may be. And in this way, the male and female will be associated in union with oneself. There's a lot to comment on this in terms of many of the in terms of many of the implications. But for now, the Zohar introduces a gendered aspect to not just individuals, but also to God, right? This is one of the ways in which the Zohar understands this dichotomy. We'll start again next Monday also with with one more source about gender, but just a couple of concluding thoughts about what the Zohar is doing here, so we understand the theological framework of the Zohar, and then we'll understand some of the solutions and start to come to that next week. God, just like all humans, is split into composite parts. And this is a tragedy, because if we remember from Maimonides, the true God, right, capital G God, the philosophic God, is one. And you can't say anything about God. But in order to create the world, God had to be split. And this was a tragedy, in some sense. It might be a tragedy that was wanted, but it's a tragedy nonetheless that God is no longer one. God is no longer fully united with God's self. And just like humans, we have different types of our personality. We have different experiences in the Zohar's language, right? And the Zohar uses very traditional gender roles to understanding what it means by male and female, right? We have certain masculine qualities to us. We have certain feminine qualities to us. But the very fact that we can talk about different personal qualities means that we are not one, right? This is very similar, just to throw a tangent that I think is really interesting and relevant. In a lot of Eastern traditions, there's a lot of focus on meditation and reduction of the self. And one of the goals of a lot of, say, Buddhist meditation is normally in our lives, right, when we're in our own head, we're often being pulled in a multiplicity of directions, and we aren't just being. And so our attention is scattered, we're worried, we're talking about this friend, this thing that we have to do, this quality about ourselves that we don't like or we do like, and this ends up splitting us, and we fail to be our true selves. And it's only through meditation, right? This is the Buddhist version, that we can come to true peace with ourselves, because we are just focusing on what is, right? Not all of these other extraneous things in our lives. The Zohar is using a very similar framework to understanding humans. Again, next week, we'll also talk a little bit about the psychological framework that the Zohar gives, both for humans and God, but it's the same thing. We are going around and we have these different qualities to us. We have the male qualities and the female qualities and all of that. And so too, God also is split into all these composite parts. And there's some sense in which there has to be a great rejoining between all these composite parts, for not just us to be our true selves, but for God to end up being back to God's true self. So just in summary, because this is setting us up nicely for next week, if you are still very confused now, please come back next week, because one of the there was a Kabbalistic book that was also produced in Spain called Sefer HaBahir. This was actually predated the Zohar, but in a lot of ways the Zohar borrows from it, and it opens up with quoting a verse from Yeshayahu, or Isaiah the prophet, and it says, all who see the light must stumble. And the Sefer Bahir writes an essay on this verse saying, it is impossible to understand any of the deep secrets of the world without spending a lot of time stumbling first. And so what it means to say is, you're going to be confused, and confusion is perhaps a necessary path to understanding actually anything about the world, as follows. So thank you, everybody. I hope this whet your appetite to come back next week. And thank you again. I'm happy to stay for a couple extra minutes if anybody has questions.
Well, first of all, I just want to say, Daniel, you know, I am never, you have never disappointed me in your stunning capacity to take incredibly difficult information and bring it to the table for both scholars and people new to a subject in a remarkable way. You're so gifted. Thank you for being here. Jim Nadler, I just want to say how happy I am to see you. It's been a long time since we've been together. I'm thrilled that you're here. I want to welcome all the people that joined us who are friends of Daniel's and followers of Daniel's. I did put a note in the chat. If you want to sign up for the class so that you'll get regular reminders. Daniel is one of our regular teachers, and also come to some of the other, in fact, the class after Daniel's class is going to be taught by Mike Myman on Maimonides exclusively. And then we have a whole course on theodicy, which should be very interesting. Anyway, you're all welcome to join here, and please feel free to stay on and ask Daniel some questions. Thank you.
Yeah, and for anybody that was interested, I'll post these sources in I will share them. I'm just making the link shareable. But yeah, if anyone has any thoughts, I am here.
Thank you. So Madalena, actually, you can copy the source sheet or the slideshow, and we can add it to the our YouTube. As we post Daniel's recordings, that would be great. Can you do that?
Great class. Thank you, Daniel. Marcia, great seeing you.
Thank you. Sure.
Good.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I noticed it was interesting. You were talking about we see the universe from our perspective, but we don't see the other side. And science, when you look at the Big Bang, scientists say the same thing, that scientists can take you up to like the billionth of the second before the Big Bang, if it's like a door. But they can't tell you what's on the other side of the door. Very much like you were talking about the Kabbalists, that you can't see, we don't know what's on the other side of the door. Even though we can take you up to the smallest fraction, what happened at the Big Bang, we can't tell you what's on the other side of it.
Yeah, I mean, there was a whole set of scientists in the last 100 years that took an interest in Kabbalah, a lot more so than any other type of Jewish literature and tradition. And so there's a reason why Kabbalah keeps on living on in some way. I mean, there was this is just like for the interesting Jewish historic background of the people that stayed for a little bit of a bonus. Kabbalah in Judaism, Jews spent about 300 years trying to bury Kabbalah, from about the 1700s to, mid 20th century. And what I mean by that is most Jews were a little bit, there were sort of two different views. One, there were a lot of Jews who were embarrassed by Kabbalah, because if you're trying to be an enlightened Jew in Europe in the 1800s and 1900s, and all of a sudden, some rabbi starts to say God is male and female, and right, like that doesn't jive with a certain upper class academic Protestant view of God that was considered to be proper. The second was that Kabbalah led to a lot of radicalism among Jews and messianism, right? So you have Shabtai Tzvi in the 1600s, who Kabbalah is very messianic by definition, because anytime you're talking about the idea of the world being broken and the need to rebuild the world, the rebuilding of the world is the Messianic age, right? And so, I mean, the Tanakh and Talmud talk about Mashiach and the Messianic age, but it's almost like an afterthought. I mean, Tanakh maybe a little bit more, but the Talmud, they talk about the Messianic age, but it's very like laissez-faire. It's very, yeah, one day this will happen. But for now, here's how to practice Judaism, and here's how to do mitzvot. There's a famous verse, a story in the Talmud that I love that says that if you're planting a tree and somebody comes and tells you that Mashiach has come, finish planting the tree and then go greet him, right? and this is totally representative of the Talmud's view of messianism. And it's because the Talmud was afraid of messianism, because in the 2nd century, there was an attempted messianic revolution, right? Bar Kokhba, that a lot of rabbis in the early Talmud actually signed on to, and it was a disaster, right? Hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed. This is what finalized Jews being actually kicked out of the land of Israel. It's one of the things that we actually mourn on Tisha B'Av. It's the last thing when Beitar, the city that was the center of Bar Kokhba's revolution, when Beitar fell in 135 CE. And so the Talmud is very wary about messianism, and Kabbalah all of a sudden goes back to it, right? Kabbalah says, our job as humans, or as Jews specifically, is to put God back together. And it's in our power, right? It's extremely empowering, right? Because it's saying that our mission is not just to perfect ourselves or society, but actually to perfect God, right? That God needs us, which is empowering, but also some people can go a little bit overboard with that and then think, I individually am the one who not only can do it, I've actually done it already. And so all of a sudden, right, that breeds a type of messianism that was dangerous, that I don't think we'll get to talk too much in this class, but I mean, this is how to understand a lot of the reason why many of these ideas, even as they've implicitly crept into Judaism, the more radical formulations are kept out, is because of Jews being afraid of messianism. But you're totally right. Within a scientific framework, this allows you, right? One of the things that Kabbalah allows you to do is it allows you to both be firmly rooted in Jewish traditionalism and also be firmly rooted in science, and to not spend your life worrying about exact reconciliations of, okay, if I believe in evolution, how do I interpret the book of Genesis, right? Kabbalah is not interested in that question. Kabbalah is saying the book of Genesis is from our side, right? It's the metaphor. It's from our finite understanding, it's how things happened. And then science is, the other side is the behind the scenes. So I love that question, James. Julian, did you have I see a hand there.
Thank you. There was just a couple of things I was wondering. So this heavenly human Adam Kadmon, whether that's within God's mind or thoughts, as it were, or a stage after that. And the other thing was this phrase from our side. It makes me think of the Kabbalistic phrase, the other side, Sitra Achra, kind of the evil side or the dark side. But now I'm thinking perhaps people could use that not for that reason, but to refer to God's side.
Yeah. When I say so you're totally right. The Sitra Achra is also a fascinating device of Kabbalah. I'll explain just for people that have never heard in 1 second. When I say from our side, I mean the Zohar uses the term mitzad shelanu, right? From probably I probably should have translated it from our perspective. I mean, sad literally means side, but like from the way that we see it. But just from what you're saying, it's really interesting. The Sitra Achra, or literally the like other force or the other being, is Kabbalah also is fascinatingly able to deal with one of the biggest problems of religion, which is, where does evil come from, right? If you're reading the Tanakh or reading the Talmud, evil comes from God, right? I mean, we read this in Shul on Tisha B'Av, right? The book of Eicha, or Lamentations, it's full of terrible things, and it's God doing the terrible things. I mean, we literally read in the book of Lamentations, God came at us like a warrior, right? I mean, you read it, quite literally, you're talking about how God is the one that destroyed Jerusalem. And this is basically the theologic view of the Talmud and, rabbinic Judaism, right? We say in Musaf on holidays, Mipnei chateinu galinu me'aretzenu, right? Because of our sins, God kicked us out of the land, right? So that's one way to deal with this problem. Kabbalah, interestingly enough, is able to evade this question, because if the universe was created from a pulling back of God, then evil is just everything that is devoid of God. So it's not that evil has its own force. It's almost the same thing as, there's no such thing as darkness, right? Darkness is just the lack of light, right? You can't create darkness, or, there's no such thing as adding darkness to a room, but you could take away light. So Kabbalah views evil the exact same way, right? Which is a lot easier and simpler of an explanation than either Maimonides, who is forced to, Maimonides' view on evil is it's just what humans do, and it's also random, right? Maimonides believed in sort of random chance of nature. The rabbis believed, theodicy was, we must have deserved it in some way. Kabbalah just says, listen, what do you expect in a world that's devoid of God? Of course there's going to be evil. And so that's where you get into this idea of, the dark side, or Sitra Achra, or whatever, in Kabbalah. But it's a fascinating and almost like a simplistically beautiful idea from Kabbalah that is relatively unknown before.
Thank you. Did you have any thoughts on the first question, whether the heavenly man or Adam Kadmon is in God's mind and thoughts, or if it's actually below that or state?
Yeah, so the problem is, I mean, that Kabbalah, that the Zohar is completely silent on anything that happens on the back end, right? And this is also how, right, the Zohar shortcuts a lot of questions. And I'm not saying this as I'm not trying to insult it, because I think it's a very profound book, but the Zohar, it's almost like, when scientists say the Big Bang, and then you ask questions like, well, where was the stuff that created the Big Bang in the first place? And since the laws of physics were only created in the Big Bang, scientists will say it's just an irrelevant question. Not that it doesn't have an answer. I'm sure there is an answer, but it's just, at least right now, it's just impossible to figure that out. Like, okay, where did if it was quantum flux, where did that come from? If it was matter, that, if it was just one particle, where did that come from? And there's just, our laws of science just end or haven't started yet before the Big Bang. It's somewhat similar, where everything that happens on the back end, where before God emanates or creates anything that's not, capital G infinite God, is just a black hole of theology. And so there really isn't any thoughts of what happened back there. Not because it's not a serious question, but I think the Kabbalists just recognize it's not it's just impossible to figure out. And so, yeah, so that would basically be my answer too. But definitely keeps me up at night if that makes you feel better. I mean, it's an interesting question, even if I have no deep thoughts on either side of it.
Thank you.
Of course. Anyone else have any thoughts, questions? Yeah, go for it, Rosalie.
You're on.
You are on mute.
I just want to say, I didn't know how much I missed you until I heard you again today. Because I've been taking these classes, and not from you, from other people, for so many years, and it just is over my head, and I absolutely understood what you were saying today. So welcome back.
Oh, that means so much. Thank you so much, Rosalie.
I'm so glad you said that, Rosalie. It affirms what I was trying to say at the beginning. Absolutely. So glad. Well, Daniel, have a wonderful week. All of you. We'll look forward to.
Thank you all. I'm excited to see you all next Monday.
And
You bet.
recordings will be available on the collaborative YouTube station, YouTube, whatever. And if you miss one of the upcoming weeks, you'll be able to catch it. And so thank you all for coming.
Thanks.
Have a great day, everyone.